Hello, folks. My name is Bernadette Smith. I am CEO of Equality Institute and author of the book Inclusive 360. And I am joined here today with Julie Kratz. Julie, would you please introduce yourself?
Hey, Bernadette. Good to be with you, allies. I have my own business, Next Pivot Point, focused on promoting allyship in the workplace.
Thanks so much, Julie, for joining me today. So I have this series called DEI Double Features, and I love to get together with my peers and talk about kind of a big idea. And one of the things that's been on my mind lately are these anti DEI headlines, this sort of fear factor that we keep seeing about retractions in DEI. But my experience has been a little bit different. So, what I'm wanted to talk about today is not believing the headlines. DEI isn't actually really going anywhere despite what you might see in the media. So,
Yeah.
just wanted to have a conversation about that today. I would love folks to interact. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments, and we'll get to them as we go through. But before we get into all that, Julie, I just wanted to acknowledge my privilege. So I say all of this, acknowledging that I'm cisgender, I'm white, I'm a gay woman, I'm a lesbian, but I have a lot of privilege. And so that colors my experience, no doubt. And I just kind of wanted to make sure I level set and acknowledge that and hopefully continue to acknowledge that as we have this
Yeah.
conversation. It's not all good news. It's
Yeah.
not.
Right. Right. And ditto. And even more markers of the dominant group here being a straight, white, non-disabled, cisgender woman. So appreciate the acknowledgement. And I think sometimes when we say things, good things, good vibes, as I know you're a big fan of, it's important, but it can feel dismissive to the harsh realities sometimes. So totally get that. But I'm a big believer DEI doesn't need to be doom and gloom. We're not going to motivate people by continuing to share the most negative aspects of humanity. So there has to be a balance. It's kind of a pendulum needs to swing not too far in either extreme, but somewhere kind of just right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there are, let's just say, there are a lot of headlines. There are layoffs and DEI cuts. There are obviously the overturning of affirmative action, the entire
Mhm.
University of Florida DEI team being cut. I mean, all of this is true. All
Yep.
of it is true. And yet I have hope. So, Julie, let's just get into that. I mean, what are you seeing in your work?
Yeah, I mean, the headlines are real. And what's interesting, though, when you contrast that to what's actually happening to our industry, right? Because headlines are written to get clicks, they're written to get attention. And we have a negativity bias as humans that our news cycle is very well aware of and takes advantage of a lot. So I don't think the headline of DEI is achieving results is going to get the same attention that the University of Florida let go of their entire DEI team, for example. So I think that's why. And I think we just have to be really cognizant of that as humans, what how we're being primed and shaped by the news cycle in general. But specifically with DEI in mind, when you look at the data of what's actually happening in our industry, we did experience a backlash. Absolutely. I mean, we're still arguably experiencing it. But for me, and the data that I'm seeing, that the peak of that backlash was really last year. Somewhere in mid-year, probably was right around the SCOTUS affirmative action decision, which was just a collision, like, you know, so many things happening at once. But after the dust kind of settled, what I have found is that companies are actually repositioning DEI internally versus externally. So, yeah, you're seeing less public statements, donations, public programs, because the ones that are serious about it are doing it for the right reason, which is means you embed it into your culture. You don't make it this, tokenizing, propaganda kind of push. You do it because it's the right thing to do. And so it's going to be less visible. So we've actually seen spend go up internally and a little less externally on folks like you and I that help companies, which I think is actually kind of a good thing. Like do the work, resource it internally now. People are getting skilled up. 4 years later, after the height of, the DEI hiring, we have a lot more experienced DEI people, which is awesome. Bring them into your organization. So we are seeing investment actually tick up a bit. And what I'm seeing with my clients, especially those that are global focused, so they're in Europe, they're in APAC, different parts of the world, they know that diversity is real. And even if you wish it's not happening, it is happening demographically, psychographically, like it is happening. And if you want to be relevant to the future consumers and customers and people and employees you want to serve, you got to do this stuff now. You can't wait until the dynamics shift entirely. And so they're being proactive. And the last thing I'll say is just the little known fact I think sometimes people don't realize is there is legislation globally driving this. And so even if you are an American based company, if you do a considerable amount of work in Europe, for example, their ESG guidelines, they have gender leadership goals for organizations, metric tracking, pay equity. If you do a sizable amount of business in that part of the world, you will be held accountable to those standards. And we're not talking 5 years from now, we're talking next year, 2025. So all the more reason, if you want to be proactive, if you want to be global and relevant, there's a great time to double down on DEI when it's getting sensationalized in the news cycle. And I think that's what you're saying too, Bernadette.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just gave me so much to chew on there. So let's go through it kind of bit by bit. I completely agree with you. I think that you're absolutely right. The demographics have changed and or are changing. And so it's just the part of doing business. It has
Mhm.
to be an imperative or you're going to be left behind. Like it's just really there's no choice. And there, it's table stakes. Having a DEI program in place is going to be table stakes as an expectation of what companies have by employee job seekers. Like
Yeah.
it's got to be a given. It's just we're so close to that being kind of the baseline expectation. And so in that sense I think that there's really no way that they can hide. you know Not
I
if
mean,
they
I
want.
guess you could for a while, but like you're gonna and this is the other thing I worry about is, these companies have made the headlines, the Targets, Chick-fil-A, y'all have seen this in the news cycle, Bud Light. That was another thing that happened last year that was weird. You're gonna run out of companies to boycott. Like, there's only so many places to shop. Most companies are gonna prioritize diversity and inclusion, whether you like it or not. And so it's coming, like you said, it's there.
Yeah, absolutely. But like you mentioned, I think that it's certainly being rebranded. I think that
Mhm.
it's being integrated more and sort of becoming a little bit more about the way we do business. And so, like you said before, I think in the past, there's especially the past few years, there was especially, 2020 and 2021, let's be honest,
Mhm.
there was that sense of performativity, that sense of, what, we've just got to get something out there and kind of check that box and make sure that we're not left behind. And I think that definitely happened. But yeah, right now things are becoming much more meaningful. And
Mhm.
I think that companies and organizations, like I said, they realize they don't have a choice, so they have to kind of get their act together and start doing meaningful work. um, but also I think that they're doing it in a way that is more embedded.
Yeah.
So for example, leadership development programs that bring a DEI lens, supplier diversity programs even within smaller companies, kind of bringing that DEI lens
Mhm.
throughout, I think is starting to happen more.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, and the best way I heard this described, I was at a Thinkers 50 conference in London last fall, and, one of the speakers, she said, "Consider DEI a row, not a column." And that speaks to this idea that we're embedding it across the organization versus siloing it. And I know you feel really strongly about this, Bernadette, with it not being nested under HR, human resources.
Yeah.
Because when we do that, DEI people don't have a seat at the table. They're not able to interact with C suite leaders. They're not taken as seriously. It becomes an initiative, more of a flavor of the month. It's not intentional. It's not as consistent as it could be, as if that person was recognized as a senior leader that they deserve to be recognized as, too. So I see those foundational shifts, companies that are embedding it in their culture, but also elevating that role. Or if they don't have a DEI role, which is kind of interesting because do you need one if it's how we behave as a culture? I think you could argue either side of that one. So I don't necessarily have a stance. I think you do what works for your culture. And if
Mhm.
having a DEI person in charge and having somebody that's delegating and embedding and pushing content and doing all the things works, great. If you believe in the power of your leadership team and your middle management, however big your leadership team is, that they can do that if they get the right toolkit and toolbox, have at it. Regardless, I think it has to be an expectation of being a leader. And this is where I'm seeing, pardon the pun, a pivot point in the work because when we hold leaders accountable for inclusive leadership behavior and get very granular about what that means, because it sounds fluffy, like, of course I'm an inclusive leader. I mean, who walks around thinking they're not inclusive or wants to not be inclusive? Very few people, I suspect.
Right.
It means specific things, and there's competencies that we are going to measure you on as a leader, whether that's 360 feedback, performance review process. There's lots of different ways to do this. Course completions, whatever it is, track it, measure it, hold them accountable, tie it to compensation and succession planning, and you will see more inclusive behavior. I promise you, just like you do
Mhm.
for other behaviors you hold people accountable for. And that's where companies that are getting serious are really lasering in on. And those, I think, Bernadette, back to our original question, I think that's why we're seeing this perception of a pushback because the companies I know and that have doubled down and are measuring and holding folks accountable now, it might have felt a little squirmy and hard for a while, but they're starting to see the results of it. They're
Mhm.
starting to see higher promotion rates of people of color and marginalized groups. They're starting to see higher retention rates. They're starting to see better employee engagement scores. I've seen it myself.
Mhm.
So they're seeing results of it at the very time. It feels like some people want us to think it's not working, which I
Right.
always find fascinating with social change. That two steps forward, one step back. But is it real? And I don't think it is real. I think we are actually seeing a lot more positive. It's just not being discussed as much as it should be.
Mm. Yeah, I think that yeah, that's a lot. And I think that, you know, I I did a keynote recently in Dubuque, Iowa, and in that keynote I talked about John Deere, a random company, but it has a very large factory in Dubuque. And in my research on John Deere, I found out that, so this is you would think very conservative company in a very conservative industry. In my research, I found that DEI is the only global behavioral performance metric. So in every employee's performance reviews across the globe, DEI related qualities, I don't know exactly what it is the only behavioral that's across the globe, which I think is really fascinating, right?
It's
And
exciting.
yeah, talking about a company with 80,000 employees. And so just to kind of do a little bit further digging, I went to Glassdoor and I looked at John Deere, and they have a 4.2 rating on DEI with 2,500 employees having scored them on that metric across a really intersectional group. So that's just like, who
Mhm.
knows? I'm not trying to, jump to conclusions, but I think that there's something there when we talk about accountability, when we talk about it being normalized, like what you're saying.
Mhm. That's so funny about John Deere. So my little known fact, my first job was in construction at Caterpillar down the road a little way. And Deere was, one of our competitors. And then I got to work with Deere as a consultant. And it's interesting because they're not, yeah, you wouldn't think in that part of the country. You'd think of all the stereotypes that sometimes are true in certain parts of the country, but you would think they would have all the excuses to run away from diversity and inclusion, but they're bigger globally than they are here in the
That's
United
right.
States. They know the power of diversity and inclusion. So that's really cool that they have the data to back it up. And what's also interesting is proves one of our theories is they're not very outspoken about that. So when I think about the companies that are leading the way, because everyone always asks, like, oh, what are the companies that are getting it right, Julie? What are the
Yeah.
case studies? Like, what are the and where my mind goes is to outspoken CEOs, like we've seen JP Morgan, Chase recently speak up about inclusion and not going away. Salesforce has spoken up over the years with Mark Benioff. So those are outward, and that's one way to show and express your support for DEI, and that's important too, especially for white male CEOs to
Hmm.
speak up. So important that models and creates safety for other folks in the dominant group. But I also really appreciate the little known stories, which reminds me, Bernadette, like Ben and Jerry's over the years. Now, I think a lot of people know about their social justice work, but when they first started doing racial justice was
Yeah.
their claim, and it really was just something they made a part of how they operated and their values, and it wasn't something they were really outward about until they got more active on social media. And I just think, like, seeing their case story and, like, how their business has grown, there seems to be a high correlation here with inclusion and business growth.
Absolutely. Now they're owned by Unilever. They're doing pretty well, I think.
Mhm.
I think that all of this, I completely agree. And, speaking of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon speaking out in support of DEI, Mark Cuban as well. Mark Cuban said recently, I take it as a given that there are people of various races, ethnicities, orientations that are regularly excluded. The loss of DEI phobic companies is my gain.
Oh,
And
yeah.
Mark Cuban seems like a pretty nice guy, but he's a capitalist. Like, he is in it for making money if you've ever seen Shark Tank. So let's be honest here. There's got to be a pragmatic reason. And I think that these guys they realize that.
Yeah. Well, I love Cubans in particular. He was pretty zesty and competitive about it, because I think sometimes inclusion feels like, well, we call it a soft skill, like it's not important, or you're being soft by talking about inclusion. And he was like, hey, your loss, my gain. Just loved how he went real competitive on it. Like, all right, see you later. Like, good luck. And we need more of that positive energy, those positive stories to help shift the narrative back to reality.
Hmm.
Because I do, back to original conversation, I think the perception that DEI is dying, or the perception that, a lot of people that don't know anything about my work, for instance, a year ago, were like, oh, DEI is having trouble. And I was like, yeah, it's like having some major trouble like a year ago. Now they're like, oh, I hear so much about your industry being in trouble. And it's like, what? No, it's not in trouble anymore. It was a year ago
Hmm.
when you gaslit me thinking I was making this up in my head. The last year was hard, I think, for a lot of us to weather that storm. And we've weathered it. We've proven that it works. I do think it's helped us focus back on the tools that really do work. So one time, one and done. Talks and keynotes and unconscious bias training are lovely for show, but do not always have the highest impact. When I show up, I'm like, I really hope this makes an impact, an hour of your life. But we know from the research, unless you embed it and it's
Hmm.
consistent and it's intentional and all the things we've been talking about, it's not going to stick. It's not going to change people's behavior overnight. So you
Yeah.
really need connective tissue across, that consistency factor.
I absolutely agree. Folks, by the way, feel free to type questions in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that. Would love to get your questions. Julie and I can answer. I'm going to put up a quote from one of my clients. Speaking of kind of the quieter companies and the quieter leaders, I spent a day with a client last week, a conservative industry in a conservative part of the country. And I was really inspired by a conversation that I was a part of with ERG leaders and some folks from the senior leadership team. And one of the leaders said, this is a member of the senior leadership team. He said, when people ask me if we're going back about DEI, I say that we're only moving forward, we're doubling down. And I just found that inspiring. And I know that he meant it. And I know that the
Mm.
ERG leaders will hold him accountable to it because they were fired up. And I know that they were really heartened by having that kind of
Cool.
support and by having knowing that their voices, their stories were being heard. Um,
Mhm.
really like listened to, and that was really inspiring for me. And I think that more and more folks are creating spaces for those conversations still,
Yeah.
still to this day. Listening sessions did not go away. Leaders are still listening.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. I love the quiet strength of that quote. Like, we're not gonna put that on our website or, do this press release, and make a big splash about it. We're just gonna quietly keep doing this work and doubling down on it because it's getting us the results we're looking for. And I suspect, I don't know this person, this leader, I would love to. Yeah, I would love to magically make more of those leaders in this world. But my guess is that they have tied this to a business problem. I think that's one of the biggest things, and I have to really attribute this Lily Zing and their work. Really, I love the question they ask in their book is what problem are we trying to solve with DEI? And it really got me thinking because I, like a lot of practitioners, having done this work for almost a decade even, I look back at the work I've done and it's like, have I really measured the results? Have I questioned the impact? Have I followed up to see how we were able to solve a problem or even kick off the engagement asking, what does success look like? What problem are we going to solve? And that was a good reminder to me that I need to be more intentional. Like if a client's not suggesting what the business problem is or has a platform already, I think we as practitioners really need to make sure that this is a prescription to a problem. Because why are
Mm,
we doing this, right? We're not just doing this to do this. I mean, well, there was the performative thing that happened, like you said, for those couple of years. But I think those people are gone. Like they weren't really here anyway, but they're definitely gone now. So like those that are left standing, if you haven't articulated the problem, what we're going to get out of this, and I do think there's just a human element to this work. We're doing it for the right reasons, yes, and business, Cuban knows this is about making money, like you said. So we've got to make sure that we don't see DEI as a separate thing. Like this is how we make money. This is how we get business done. It just happens to come from doing the right thing.
yeah, I agree. I think that you're absolutely right. And I see a question here. I struggle in this question, and I'm doing some personal research how gender equity is marginalized men of color in mid level and senior leadership.
Yeah.
Um, Concerned about the long term impact.
That's interesting. I don't know, Bernadette. I know you point to a lot of the McKinsey research just as I do. I'd be curious to see the data on that. I do think there's a zero-sum game mentality that is somehow sometimes reinforced in DEI work that if white women, if we focus on gender, then we're, not focusing on race. And I think what's so cool about Gen Z, and you shared those stats earlier, like the old rules are out, like neurodiversity, LGBTQ, gender fluidity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity. There's just so much happening from identity perspective simultaneously with that generation that I don't think it's going to be an either or approach like maybe folks in my generation looked at. But certainly, if folks have data on that, I'd love to see it. I'm not familiar with it myself.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything recent regarding that specifically. I mean, I've seen the recent LinkedIn Women in the Workplace study. Things are not changing very much, very quickly, and so. I don't know that that's, yeah, I don't have anything really much more to add about that, but I'll be really curious. So please stay in touch and let us know as you go through your own personal research. Please keep us posted on what you find, and I'll keep an eye out as well.
Yeah, the lean in research, the McKinsey research. I'm trying to think. LinkedIn just did a study, like you said. There's several if you Google them. What I've seen in it being Women's History Month and International Women's Day last month or last week, I think it's important to recognize that we're not really seeing a lot of positive momentum with women in the workplace. I think we think that things are a lot better than they actually are in reality, right? We hit a record number of women at the C-suite, at CEO positions, for example, double digits for the first time, which I found really hard to celebrate. And I think it's backslid now. It's single digits again.
Yeah,
And women of color, that story is even worse. So we got a lot of work to do. And I
we
do appreciate organizations celebrating Women's History Month, but just like Black History Month last month and Autism Awareness Month next month and AAPI month and Pride month and all the months coming up, please don't let these conversations happen in silos and only in those months. I really think people are very tired of that. And so let's not be performative. Let's keep the conversation going year round.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, Pride Month, great. We do a lot of Pride workshops, but let's talk about your transgender inclusion strategy. Let's talk about your self ID program that you probably don't have. So those are the types of things that I think can make a really sustainable impact, right? Year round, kind of supplemental to the work of those heritage months. Let's talk about operationalizing those particular identities to make sure that everyone is included.
Yeah, I think systems work. A lot of the clients that we're working with that we've had the privilege to work with over the last few years, it's less about training and education. It's still part of it, right? Because language is changing, issues are changing, people need to stay up to date. But it's more about systems work. Okay, what does our hiring process look like?
Mm-hmm.
Where are the biases?
Mm-hmm.
How are we making sure somebody of a different identity feels comfortable and heard and seen? Who are we promoting? Who are we not promoting? Who speaks up in meetings? Who doesn't? I mean, there's just all, it's like riddled everywhere. You can just,
Mm-hmm.
Bernadette, you and I say, I'm like, invite me to one of your meetings and I'll just listen and just, I can tell you a lot about your culture just from watching a meeting, not to be creepy, but it's just, there's so many indicators that if we were paying attention to these micro behaviors, that's a representation of the larger culture. And that's what we really have to dismantle. I think that's why this works so hard is the systems piece does not change quickly. And so we just kind of bite size it, just start baby steps and just keep going.
That's right. And I love to celebrate all of the wins, all of the baby steps, because when we do that, we can build momentum and we can inspire others and we can have stories to tell. So, folks who know me know that I love to celebrate the wins and all the baby steps. And we know that progress is long, it's slow. But if we don't celebrate the wins, then it feels a lot longer and a lot slower.
Yeah. And it's depressing. I mean, this work is really hard. You and I have been doing this for a really long time, and I have colleagues that have done it way longer than me. And whatever fatigue we're calling it nowadays is very real. And I think we do need to find the genuine, true, positive examples. And that's why every Saturday morning I get my newsletter and I go through it and like Bernadette's found it again. And there's always a story there that I have not, and I follow this stuff that I haven't seen. So wherever you get your information is a very positive place. I love that.
Thank you. I have a lot of sources, and I even have some people who send me stories. So,
Mm.
folks, including you, Julie, please, if you see a story that would count as a good vibe in DEI, especially ones that are kind of random, I love random acts of inclusion. Please send it along. I'd love to share it, and I'll give you a little hat tip for sharing a story with me. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, if you haven't subscribed, folks, definitely plug for Bernadette. Subscribe to her newsletter. It's
Thank you.
rich with information and very digestible.
And follow Julie's writing on Forbes. You could follow her specifically on
Oh,
Forbes, which
thank
I do.
you.
So I get a
I wrote
week.
about this topic. You and I got off the phone last week, and I was like, "All right, I'm ticked off. I'm writing an article." Actually,
Yeah, and
it's just
you
like it's not dying. Stop this. I'm so sick of that question, and I'm so glad we got to chat about it today because it just doesn't seem like fair journalism to paint a picture that's overwhelmingly negative when I've seen a lot of bright spots.
that's right. Thank you. Well said. Well said to wrap this up. So, folks, in conclusion, my perspective as a privileged white cisgender woman is that DEI is alive and well. And hopefully, you get a chance to check out all the reasons that Julie and I, agree, have had that perspective.
Yeah.
Julie,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah. Thanks, listeners. Thanks, Bernadette. This is awesome. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Bye, everyone. Take care.